inviting me here to beautiful Quebec to talk this morning. What I would like to do is to look at three things this morning. There's been a question asked in critical studies of men and masculinities about whether the term masculinity has seen its day. Should we now stop talking about the notion, the concept of masculinity? And Jeff Hearn phrased this very well when he says, to date, masculinity has served a purpose in developing a focus on men. The question is whether it has now served its purpose. So what I'd like to try and do, hopefully in the next 20 minutes, is to look at current critiques of the concept of masculinity, then try and outline a concept of masculinity that I think survives these critiques, and then to show why this particular concept is of use. So I'll begin by considering the main critiques that have been applied to the concept of masculinities. The first critique really has been found in the work of Jeff Hearn and Kenneth Clatterborough. And although their critiques vary slightly, they share some main features. In short, within these critiques, masculinity, it's said, is used in a way where it is taken for granted what it means. It's self-evident what it means. There's a lack of clearly defining the concept. In addition, they argue that the concept of masculinity has been hijacked by the sciences, psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, in ways that reduce the notion of masculinity to a set of characteristics that men possess in greater or lesser amounts. And finally, within this critique, it's argued that masculinity becomes presented in and of itself as an underlying cause of social problems. And in doing so, it detracts from actually looking at what men do. So the social problems around men's actions, for example, around men's violence, are not seen to be about what men do. They're seen to be the fault of this nebulous concept called masculinity. And I agree within this critique with many of these points. It is important to be clear when we use the term masculinity exactly what we mean. We don't all share the same understanding of it, so it is important to be precise when we talk about it. We should certainly avoid seeing masculinity as a set of characteristics to be measured. And also, we should definitely consider the complexity of men's actual, real, material practices, rather than making very simplistic links between masculinity that in some way predicts simply particular actions of men. However, I don't think that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't know if that phrase translates very well. Oh, good. So, whilst a lot of these critiques that Hearn and Clatterborough talk about hold up, I don't think that itself means that we should dispense with the notion of masculinity altogether. So there's a second round of critiques, what might be termed masculinity and the postmodern. And this is a very diverse set of critiques, but certainly in relation to masculinity, aspects of it can be found in Alan Peterson's work and in the work of John McInnes. So again, there are common threads within this work. Firstly, masculinity as a term, they argue, essentialises the character of men. It makes it sound like a biological given. And this also creates a false unity. It has homogenising tendencies. We talk about men as if all men are the same, whereas they argue, quite rightly, that identity needs to be understood as a little bit more fragmented, fluid and multiple. Also linked to this, whilst the notion of masculinity tends to homogenise men, it also therefore polarises issues between men and women. It creates a false binary between men and women. They also argue that masculinity as such only exists in discourse, and therefore the only significant questions that we ought to be asking about masculinity relate to its occasions of use, questions about when it's used, by whom, and for what purpose. So masculinity they see as a political term that's often used for political ends. And again, I agree with much of this. I think a lot of these arguments have a lot of validity. It is vital that we don't essentialise and homogenise men, but it's also important not to create false binaries, as they can serve to obscure connections and similarities between men and women. For example, the shared health issues and poor health outcomes for Indigenous men and women shouldn't be overlooked by creating a false binary that we're somehow always in competition between men and women. Men and women often share similarities. Particular groups of men and women often share similarities. However, it is still important to recognise how men are bound together as a gender class and the patriarchal dividend that accrues from that and the representational and material impact that that has. It is true that discourse in and of itself helps us interrogate when, why and how the concept of masculinity is used. But it's also important to recognise that an emphasis only on discourse can itself obscure a focus on the materiality and corporeality that are significant in relation to men and health. A final area of critique that's been levelled against masculinity and health, and I was very pleased when I was speaking to John MacDonald last night to hear that his presentation is going to be almost the antithesis of mine. So I think we would both hope that we can generate some debate around this whilst we're here. John presents some very strong arguments around, again, arguing that masculinity is often presented as something endogenous to men, something that men somehow possess, and this reflects the arguments that Jeff Hearn was talking about that we were looking at earlier. And men somehow internalise, through processes of socialisation, amounts of masculinity to greater or lesser extents. Masculinity, then, the adoption of male stereotypes or the socialisation into particular male stereotypes, is often used in a negative or pejorative way to explain men's poorer health practices and outcomes. And again, this links to the arguments that Jeff Hearn was making, that masculinity can be used as some kind of explanation for what men do, and that actually obscures men's real health practices and outcomes.